A single bullet shattered the morning stillness, ripping through metal and splintering glass, scattering peace like ashes on the wind. There's something cruel about how silence breaks not with warning, not gently, but suddenly and violently, thrusting ordinary people into extraordinary nightmares. It wasn't the kind of storm anyone saw coming. No darkening clouds or whispered warnings, just cold steel and colder hearts. A desperate journey had begun, forged by secrets hidden in shadows, and truths buried beneath snowdrifts stained red. They say some roads lead to salvation, others straight to hell. Today, those roads became one. Survival was no longer a question, it was a prayer whispered against the deafening roar of betrayal and bullets. Because in a world twisted by lies, the only thing more dangerous than the truth is someone willing to tell it. Frank Garrett had grown used to the quiet of Montana's backcountry, but tonight the wind seemed to carry a different, more urgent warning. At 65, he felt each gust rattle his bones with the reminder of all the years he'd spent trying to forget a past life he had once cherished. He stood on the porch of his simple wooden cabin, part workshop, part home, watching as the sky roiled with thick clouds. Snow began to drift across the gravel yard, dusting the rows of broken-down cars that awaited his practiced hands. Over the decades, he had pulled engines apart and pieced them back together, finding more comfort in crankshafts and the spark plugs than in the company of other humans. A single bare bulb illuminated the edges of his property, reflecting on the battered sign that read Garrett's Repair. To most passers-by, this was just another small-town garage. But for Frank, it was the last outpost of solitude he had left in the world. He still remembered the day he walked away from everything. 2 decades earlier, Frank had been a brilliant engineer working on classified avionics for the military. He believed in the system, believed that protecting his country was the highest calling. But one catastrophic crash changed all that. 14 lives lost, and a scapegoat needed. When the higher-ups pinned the blame on him for a data misread he had explicitly warned them about, Frank realized the truth: loyalty went only one way in that world. He took the settlement, cut his losses, and left behind the labyrinth of bureaucrats and profit-driven contractors. Here, in the cold hush of Montana, he found a kind of peace. He spent his days rebuilding trucks, tractors, sometimes even ancient farm equipment the locals brought by. The nights, however, could stretch on into a loneliness so deep it made him wonder if he was truly alive or just existing. Tonight, though, that stillness cracked under the weight of the howling wind. A storm was coming, and Frank recognized the signs. The temperature plummeted faster than usual, and thick flakes began to swirl in earnest, blanketing everything in a layer of white. He'd already fed the wood stove, checked the generator, and sealed the windows as best he could. Normally, he'd settle in with a can of chili and a chipped mug of coffee, maybe thumb through an old mechanical manual or watch a war documentary until he fell asleep. But something in the air told him there would be no settling in tonight. He saw it first as a quick flicker in the periphery of his vision, a faint silhouette moving near the side of his garage, where the overhead light didn't quite reach. Frank's heart quickened. He reached behind the door, feeling for the old shotgun he kept loaded with rock salt, more deterrent than lethal force. The last time he'd had an uninvited visitor this far out, it was a lone coyote scavenging for scraps. But coyotes didn't knock. Somewhere between gusts of wind, he heard a soft, hesitant rap at the large metal door. It didn't sound threatening, rather. It was almost apologetic. Frank hesitated, the shotgun resting loosely in his grip. He could turn off the lights and pretend nobody was home. But that wasn't who he was. In his youth, he might have believed in the good in people. Even if he doubted it now, something inside him refused to let another soul freeze to death out there. He edged along the side of the workshop, every muscle in his body tensed. The swirling snow made visibility tough, but the footprints, faint depressions rapidly filling with fresh flakes, told him someone had come from the tree line. Approaching the metal garage door, Frank called out, "Who's there?" No immediate response. Just a ragged cough and a muffled apology that sounded like a woman's voice. Pressing a shoulder to the door, he lifted it a few inches, letting in a blast of stinging air. The glow from inside spilled out across a figure crouched in exhaustion. She looked to be in her early 40s, wearing a heavy coat that had clearly seen better days and clutching a small duffel bag like it was a life preserver. Snow clung to her hair and eyelashes, and Frank could see the raw desperation in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she managed, words trembling as fiercely as the wind around her. "I didn't know where else to go. The storm. It's too much." Frank quickly scanned her face, noticing the lines of stress and fatigue. This woman, whoever she was, did not look like a local. He'd lived here long enough to recognize most folks in the region. Also, the coat she wore wasn't cheaply made. It had the look of someone who once had money or a professional life. That set off a small alarm bell in his mind. People who showed up unexpectedly in the dead of winter often carried complicated stories. Yet, as suspicious as he might be, Frank couldn't ignore the primal human instinct to help. He raised the door wider, gesturing her inside. "Come on before you freeze to death," he said more brusquely than he intended. She all but crawled in, letting out a breath of relief when the relative warmth of the workshop hit her. Frank closed the door behind them and switched on additional lights. His garage was a maze of half-disassembled engines, crates of tools, and old tarps. A single space heater sat in the corner, next to a battered recliner he used on nights he stayed up working. "You can sit there," he said, pointing the barrel of the shotgun away from her, but not entirely out of reach. "Don't try anything stupid." The woman raised her hands in a gesture of surrender. "I'm not here to cause trouble," she said quietly. "I just need shelter. My car got stuck a few miles back. Cell phone's dead." She dropped her bag to the floor, exhaling shakily as she collapsed into the chair. Up close, Frank noticed her cheeks were bright with windburn, and her fingers trembled as she reached out toward the space heater. Frank leaned the shotgun against a nearby workbench, crossing his arms over his chest. "Name's Frank Garrett," he offered, still keeping a cautious distance. "I don't usually do the whole bed and breakfast thing, but you look half frozen." She attempted a smile, her lips chapped and cracked. "I'm Sarah," she replied, voice raw. "Sarah McAllister. Thank you for letting me in." For a moment, Frank debated asking her a dozen questions: why she was out here, where she'd come from, and what her bag contained, but the shock in her eyes told him she needed a minute to recover. He handed her a thermos of lukewarm coffee he'd left by the welding table. An hour later, the wind had turned into a full-blown tempest, rattling the corrugated metal walls of the garage. Outside, snowdrifts piled higher against the structure with every passing minute. Frank had moved Sarah to a small corner he had cordoned off as a makeshift resting spot. He'd thrown down a cot, some old blankets, and placed the heater a bit closer. She looked marginally better, the color returning to her face as she sipped the last of the coffee. Despite the warmth, tension lingered in the air. Frank sensed she was holding something back, anxious glances at her duffel bag, the way she tensed whenever he walked too close. "Mind telling me what you were doing out there this late?" he finally asked, breaking the silence. He sat down on an old stool, resting his elbows on his knees, posture neither threatening nor fully relaxed. The place was bright enough now that he could make out the finer details. Sarah's coat had a logo stitched on the inside, some high-end brand he recognized from big city stores. Her boots were similarly expensive. She didn't match the profile of a typical hitchhiker or wanderer. Sarah inhaled sharply. "It's complicated," she began, eyes flicking to the duffel. "Let's just say I had to leave somewhere in a hurry. Didn't think the roads would get this bad so fast. I wasn't trying to trespass. Your light was on, and I thought maybe it was a house or a small inn." Frank frowned. "Montana storms don't play nice," he said simply. "If your car's stuck miles away, you were lucky to make it here alive." Leaning in, he added, "I'm not looking to pry into your business, but out here, folks tend to watch each other's backs, or watch them out the door if they bring trouble." She considered him for a moment, visibly weighing how much to reveal. "I'm not a criminal, if that's what you're asking," she said, and then, as if anticipating his next question, added, "But I am in trouble with some powerful people. I used to work for a big financial corporation, and I found out things I wasn't supposed to. I took evidence with me, and now they want it back." Frank tried not to let his reaction show, but his heart skipped a beat. He had seen enough underhanded dealings in his time, especially with corporate contractors. He simply nodded, letting her continue. Sarah tapped her duffel bag with the tip of her boot. "I can't tell you everything." But inside here she hesitated. Clearly torn is proof that Global Trust Inc. has been laundering money. Billions. Maybe. I was their lead cybersecurity officer until I confronted them. They locked me out, called me mentally unstable, and froze my assets. So I took what I could and ran. Frank let out a low whistle. "Sounds like you bit off a chunk of the hornet's nest," he muttered. "And you think they'll come all the way out here to find you?" Her eyes met his, unwavering. "I'm certain of it." A heavy silence settled between them. Frank rocked back on the stool. This was exactly the kind of mess he'd spent years avoiding. He couldn't deny a certain sympathy stirring inside him, but he'd also seen how ruthless corporations could be. "For tonight," he said at length, "you stay. Storm's too dangerous to send you off anyway. But tomorrow, we'll see." Morning arrived with the whine of wind still pressing against the walls. Though the snowfall had slowed, Frank opened the side door of the garage to gauge the situation, only to find the drifts were up to his waist. The sky was a bleak gray, promising more snowfall before noon. He sighed and shut the door, shaking ice off his boots. Sarah was awake, rummaging through her duffel, presumably checking on the mysterious data stash she carried. He noted how she kept the bag close, as if it were the only thing tethering her to a future. They hadn't exchanged much conversation after her revelation, both needing space to reflect on the collision of their lives. Frank reminded himself he had no obligation to get involved. Once the storm cleared, she could leave, and he could return to his solitary existence. Yet, a nagging sense of responsibility gnawed at him, a memory of how easily good people could be crushed by machinery bigger than them. He was about to ask Sarah if she wanted more coffee when the sound of engines disrupted the quiet. Low and rumbling, they drew closer until multiple headlights cut through the snowy haze outside. Frank tensed, grabbing the shotgun from the workbench. He peered through a small window, and sure enough, a convoy of black SUVs navigated the buried driveway with surprising precision. He counted 6, then 8, finally a dozen in total, forming a semicircle near his front porch. Sarah's face went pale as she joined him at the window. "They found me," she whispered, voice tight with dread. This soon Frank felt a surge of anger, tempered by caution. "You sure it's them?" he asked, though the men stepping out of the vehicles armed, wearing black tactical coats, were answer enough. One figure stood out, a tall, broad man with a shaved head and a gaze as cold as the Montana winter. He carried himself like a military officer but wore a sleek black coat more fitting for an executive. He barked orders to his team, who began scanning the property methodically. Sarah swallowed hard. "Dominic Shaw," she said, "head of Global Trust Security Division. He's ex-military. Not the type to reason with." Frank ground his teeth. Memories of his own run-ins with corporate-backed security flickered in his mind. He decided there was no point in letting them come banging on the door. Carefully, he slid open the garage door just enough to step out. Shotgun in hand, though muzzle angled downward, he confronted Dominic and his men. The wind stung his face, swirling fine crystals of snow around their legs. "Something I can help you with?" Frank growled, keeping his posture firm but not overtly aggressive. Dominic smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We're sorry to intrude," he said in a clipped tone. "I'm looking for a woman who may have passed through here last night. Dark hair, about this tall." He gestured vaguely. "Goes by Sarah McAllister. Have you seen anyone on your property?" Frank spat on the ground, more out of habit than disrespect. "Just me and the wind." He lied. Nobody shows up in a storm like this unless they got a death wish. Dominic's gaze flickered to the garage, then back to Frank's face. "May we come inside and look around?" Frank shook his head, chin set. This is private property. Without a warrant or a badge, you ain't stepping a foot in. Behind him, he heard the faint creak of the side door as Sarah peeked out, no doubt preparing to flee if necessary. He hoped she remained hidden. Dominic's men spread out, forming a subtle half-circle around Frank, though they tried to appear non-threatening. The tall security chief glanced at Frank's shotgun, then locked eyes with him. "We're not here to cause trouble," Dominic said, each word carefully measured. "But the person we're looking for is a critical witness in an investigation. We have reason to believe she may be suffering from delusions." He offered a thin-lipped, polite smile that almost froze in the frigid air. "We only want to ensure her safety and the integrity of the information she has." Frank felt his irritation flare. He knew the type well-spoken corporate enforcers who twisted words like a politician. "Never heard of her," he replied. "Storm's got everything locked down. You fellas better head back before you get snowed in yourselves." Dominic raised an eyebrow, as though evaluating whether Frank was just a stubborn old man or someone worth suspecting. Then, with a curt nod, he signaled his men to step back. "If she does show up, or if you hear anything, please give me a call." He extended a business card between two gloved fingers. Frank didn't move to take it, so Dominic gently placed it on the hood of an old Chevy parked nearby. "We can offer a substantial reward," Dominic added, voice dropping to a quieter, more menacing tone. "You might find that helpful out here." Frank's stare didn't waver. "I've lived fine without your money," he said, concluding the exchange. With a final glance around, Dominic motioned for his men to retreat. The SUVs reversed in practiced unison, tires crunching over the snow. Within minutes, the convoy was disappearing into the swirling white distance, leaving Frank alone in the yard. As soon as they were out of sight, Sarah emerged from the garage. She looked shaken, her face taut with worry. "They're not going to stop," she murmured. "Dominic doesn't quit until he gets what he wants." Frank exhaled, a cloud of breath fogging in the air. "Then we have to figure out your next move," he said gruffly. "And we gotta do it quick." The potential danger was far from over, and he could feel the old instincts stirring within him. Instincts from his years designing systems that had to survive sabotage. From the times he'd navigated classified protocols that demanded absolute caution. As much as he hated to admit it, he was in deep now. He brushed past Sarah, heading into the garage, pulling the door shut behind him. "You said you have evidence," he stated, more than asked. "Proof of major wrongdoing by Global Trust. That means you also have a target on your back. If they've tracked you here, they'll come again. Next time, I doubt they'll be as polite." Sarah nodded, eyes downcast. "I didn't plan on dragging anyone else into this. I just wanted to get to Colorado, where a friend can help me verify these files and make them unalterable proof." Didn't expect a storm like this or that Dominic would move so fast. Frank rubbed his temples. "We'll handle the storm. We'll handle them. But from now on, we move smart and we move careful." He wasn't sure why he said we, or when he decided to cast his lot with this stranger. Maybe he saw something of his younger self in her, someone who believed in doing the right thing, even when it was the hardest choice. Or maybe he was just tired of running from who he used to be. A day passed, and the storm showed no signs of relenting. Heavy snowdrifts barricaded Frank Garrett's property, effectively cutting them off from the main road. Inside the cramped garage, the air felt charged with tension. At times, Frank would tinker with the engine of an old truck, wiping grease from his calloused hands and stealing glances at Sarah McAllister as she hovered near the space heater. She tried to appear calm, but every so often, her gaze flicked toward the window, as though expecting headlights to crest the hill once more. She spent much of the morning hunched over a battered laptop, which she'd pulled from her duffel bag along with several external drives. Curious, Frank wandered over, noticing rows of code scrolling across the screen. He recognized some of it checksum verifications, secure hashing algorithms, encrypted logs. It reminded him of his own time in secure aerospace programs, though what Sarah was doing seemed more financial in nature. "You said you used to be a cybersecurity officer." He said, arms folded. That how you got hold of these files? Sarah nodded, not looking up from the screen. Global Trust hired me to design a fail-safe system that could track all transactions across their investment arms. The idea was to ensure transparency for stakeholders. But then I discovered a shadow ledger, a hidden pipeline funneling massive amounts of money to offshore accounts. When I tried to raise the alarm, they locked me out. She paused, exhaling shakily. This data here, it's the real ledger, the one they erased. If I can prove it's authentic and show how they falsified the official logs, I can blow the lid off their operation. Frank scratched the stubble on his chin. You're risking your life for something that big, he said. He didn't phrase it as a question, it was an observation. He could sense the underlying complexity. Corporations didn't take kindly to whistleblowers, especially those who threatened their bottom line. His own experiences with hush money settlements told him that Global Trust would spare no expense to silence her. It's not just about money, she replied softly. They're siphoning pension funds, public investments, even veterans' benefits. People are losing everything, and they don't even know it. I can't just walk away. A wave of respect, tinged with apprehension, swept through Frank. He understood all too well the weight of doing the right thing in a system designed to punish integrity. So, you wanted to reach Colorado, he said, changing the subject slightly. Why there? Sarah clicked a final command and closed the laptop. A friend of mine, Thomas Bridges, was part of a military cybersecurity unit. He's got the tools to verify this data properly. Once he does, we can hand it off to authorities who still have some semblance of moral compass. Frank nodded slowly. He glanced outside, where the snow still fell in heavy sheets. We won't get anywhere unless this storm passes. And once it does, we need to slip out before Dominic Shaw and his goons come back. His mind flicked to the shotgun propped against the wall. He wondered if it would be enough if another convoy arrived, this time with less polite intentions. Sarah's mouth tightened into a thin line. Dominic's relentless. I used to see how he handled internal issues. He'll come back ready for a fight. She shook her head, a glimmer of desperation in her eyes. I hate dragging you into this. Frank. He merely shrugged. I've been in worse scrapes. Besides, out here, we help each other. That's how we survive. Outside. The Montana sky remained leaden and impenetrable. The garage's single overhead light cast long shadows on the floor, where scattered wrenches and spare parts glinted like silent witnesses to the uneasy alliance forming between Frank and Sarah. As daylight gave way to dusk, they prepared for a possible confrontation. Frank erected makeshift barricades at the property's perimeter, piling old tractor tires and wooden pallets to slow any incoming vehicles. While hardly a fortress, it was better than leaving the approach wide open. At Sarah's suggestion, they also devised a low-tech alarm system, a series of thin wires connected to tiny bells, strung between trees and fence posts. If someone tried sneaking in on foot, they'd set off a metallic jingle that might give Frank and Sarah an extra moment to react. It felt almost quaint, relying on bells and wires. But Frank's property lacked the high-tech sensors or cameras that modern security would require. What they had, instead, was resourcefulness. By early evening, the two of them reconvened near the workbench. Sarah quietly checked her laptop battery and the state of her external drives. Frank gathered a modest armory, the shotgun, a hunting rifle, and an old service pistol. He set them on the bench, ensuring each was in working order. I was trained to build planes, not shoot guns, he muttered. But life sometimes changes your skill set. Sarah watched him with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. Where I come from, people don't keep loaded guns at home. But I guess out here, it's different. Frank gave a small shrug. Montana's got its own rules. You learn them or you freeze out. He handed her the pistol, showing her how to check the safety and load the magazine. Her fingers trembled slightly, but to her credit, she listened attentively and nodded. I hope it doesn't come to this, she said quietly. Same here, he replied. But he remembered Dominic Shaw's face, calculated and cold, a man used to power. Frank doubted a simple conversation would dissuade Shaw if he showed up. The memory made his hand tighten around the rifle's stock. They shared a quick meal of canned stew heated on a portable camping stove. The steam rose in curls, warming them against the chill that still seeped through the garage's thin insulation. Conversation was minimal, but the tension was clear. Sarah stared into the chipped bowl as though seeing the faces of everyone who'd pinned her as unstable. Frank found himself wanting to reassure her, but words felt inadequate. After dinner, they took turns keeping watch. Frank insisted Sarah rest for a few hours, so she curled up on the cot with the space heater nearby. He sat on a rickety chair by the garage's main door, rifle across his lap. For a time, his mind drifted to old regrets, people he'd lost, moments he'd run away. He thought about the crash that had ended his career, about the families who never got answers, and how the truth had been sacrificed for corporate convenience. Maybe, in helping Sarah, he could atone for all the times he'd chosen silence. Snow pelted the metal roof, a steady rhythm that formed a kind of grim lullaby. As the hours crept by, Frank found his eyelids growing heavier. He forced himself to stay alert, but the storm outside held its own hush. Perhaps Dominic Shaw wouldn't be stupid enough to approach again in such weather. But Frank had learned long ago that underestimating an adversary was the quickest way to lose. In the soft glow of dawn, the storm finally broke, leaving a hush over the landscape. The snowdrifts glittered under a pale sun that struggled to break through the clouds. Frank was outside, clearing a path with a battered snow shovel, when he heard Sarah call his name. Her voice carried a note of urgency. He set the shovel against the side of the cabin and stomped fresh snow from his boots before heading back inside. Sarah was hunched over her laptop again. "I just got it to boot properly. The battery's nearly shot, but I found some extra logs that might help us," she said, eyes flicking up at him. She tapped a few keys, bringing up lines of data that scrolled faster than Frank could read. "English, please," he joked, though his gaze was serious. "What's that telling us?" Sarah's jaw tightened. "It's a secondary ledger that cross-references the main transactions? Sort of a backup record. If I can pair it with a verification key like a digital fingerprint, then I can prove beyond any doubt that Global Trust has been tampering with official data." "Is that something you can do from here?" Frank asked, glancing at the thick insulation he had stapled over the garage's windows. They had no Wi-Fi, no reliable phone signal. Montana's remote corners were known for patchy reception at the best of times, and the storm certainly hadn't improved matters. Sarah shook her head. "I need specialized equipment, or at least a stable connection to a secure server. That's why I was heading to Colorado to see Thomas Bridges. He has a private lab set up and owes me a favor." Frank leaned against the workbench, arms crossed. "We'd have to dig your car out first, if it's even salvageable, and we'll need to do it without drawing any attention. I'm guessing Dominic Shaw isn't the type to give up after one visit." Sarah pursed her lips. "No, he isn't. But maybe the break in the weather will give us a window to slip away quietly." Before Frank could respond, a faint jangling noise cut through the silence, one of their makeshift bell alarms. Frank instantly straightened, grabbing the rifle from the wall. Sarah went pale, clutching the pistol he'd taught her to use. They exchanged a glance before Frank moved to the small window to peer outside. Amidst the bright reflection of snow, he saw a lone figure swaying slightly, making their way around the edge of the property. The figure was bundled in a thick coat, face obscured by a hood. This was no tactical approach by a squad of mercenaries. "Stay here," Frank instructed, creeping out through a side exit to circle around behind the visitor. As he approached, the crunch of snow under his boots gave him away. The stranger turned, pulling back the hood. A young man barely out of his teens stood there, one arm wrapped in a makeshift sling. He looked frightened more than anything else. I'm lost," the young man stammered. "Car broke down on the road. Saw the smoke from your chimney." Frank scanned the area suspiciously, but saw no sign of additional vehicles or armed backup. He considered sending the kid away. They were in the midst of a precarious situation, and the last thing they needed was another mouth to feed or a potential spy. Yet, the kid's eyes were bloodshot and his face pinched from the cold. "All right," Frank muttered. "Come with me, but keep your hands where I can see 'em." Sarah breathed a sigh of relief when she saw Frank leading the young man whose name was Mark Holliday into the garage, rather than brandishing a firearm at him. Mark's coat was torn, and a patch of dry blood stained the sleeve around his makeshift sling. He appeared exhausted, wincing with every small movement. Frank set the rifle aside but kept it within reach. Found him stumbling around the tree line, Frank explained tersely, escorting Mark to a rickety stool near the space heater. Says his car broke down on the main road. We'll have to confirm if that's true, but he's injured. Sarah approached, her guarded expression softening. She was no stranger to triage. Her father had been a doctor. She carefully helped Mark remove the coat and used a pair of scissors to expose his wounded arm. An ugly gash stretched across the bicep, likely from shattered glass or twisted metal. The makeshift bandage was soaked through with half-frozen blood. "What happened?" she asked, doing her best to keep her voice calm. Mark winced, skidded on black ice, hit a tree, managed to crawl out the passenger side. But my phone's dead and I couldn't call for help. His gaze flickered around, taking in the Spartan, tool-laden garage. When his eyes landed on the firearms, he swallowed hard. "Are you two, like, survivalists or something?" Frank almost laughed but suppressed it into a grunt. "Something like that. Stay still. We'll see about disinfecting that cut." He rummaged through a small first aid kit he kept in the garage, placing a bottle of antiseptic and clean gauze on the workbench. Sarah took over, silently thanking her father's old lessons. She dabbed at the wound, ignoring Mark's pained hiss. While Sarah treated Mark's injury, Frank kept watch. He eyed the outside through a gap in the plywood he'd used to reinforce the windows. So far, nothing unusual, just acres of white, blanketed farmland and distant pines. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling they were on borrowed time. The storm's pause meant Dominic Shaw could try another approach. Once Sarah finished wrapping Mark's arm, she stepped back. "We've got some canned food," she said. "You should eat. Warm up. Then maybe Frank can go check on your car." Mark nodded gratefully. "Thank you. Really. I was sure I wouldn't make it another hour in that cold." He studied Sarah's face, then Frank's. "You have no idea how much I appreciate this." Frank handed him a bowl of heated soup. "Eat up," he grunted. "But we can't give you a permanent home here. As soon as you can travel, we'll point you toward the main road or the nearest town." Sarah shot Frank a look, as though to ask if that was really necessary. Frank returned her gaze, silently urging her to remember how precarious their position was. The last thing they needed was an extra wild card. After all, Mark could be innocent or he could be planted by Dominic's team. It wouldn't be the first time corporate security used civilian-looking scouts to locate a target. For now, Mark sipped his soup, looking more like a frightened animal than a threat. Frank turned to Sarah. "We'll give him a day to recover. Then we move, storm or not. We can't stay holed up here forever." Sarah swallowed, fear and determination battling in her expression. She nodded. "Agreed. Once it's safe, we head for Colorado. I just hope we can slip out without leaving a trail." The remainder of that morning felt like waiting out the calm before a second storm. Frank ventured beyond the garage to locate Mark's car. Snow crunched under his boots as he followed the rough directions Mark had given. About half a mile down the road, he found a rusted sedan half buried in a snowbank, its front end wrapped around a fallen pine. A shattered windshield explained the gash on Mark's arm. The engine block was cracked, fluids frozen solid. The car was worthless. As he returned to the garage, Frank considered the possibility of Mark being a liability. Could the kid inadvertently lead Dominic Shaw to them? Or worse, be part of Shaw's operation? But nothing about Mark suggested corporate muscle. He barely looked old enough to have a stable job, let alone be a covert agent. Frank decided he'd keep a close eye on him anyway. Back inside, Sarah had stowed her equipment and was checking Mark's bandages. He seemed genuinely grateful, glancing between them with nervous curiosity. "You're not exactly typical Good Samaritans," he remarked, eyes flitting to the array of weapons and the messy tangle of wires rigged as alarms. "What's really going on here?" Frank paused in the doorway, removing his gloves and stomping off clumps of snow. "We're just people trying to stay safe," he said, carefully omitting the details. "We've got our reasons for taking precautions. Best if you don't ask too many questions." Sarah offered Mark a half smile, as though an apology. "We don't mean to be hostile," she added gently. "It's just complicated." She shot a quick, pointed look at Frank, silently reminding him that Mark was, at the very least, an injured traveler in need of basic kindness. Mark nodded, visibly torn between gratitude and lingering suspicion. "Look, I don't want to pry. I just needed help. If you can show me how to get to the nearest town, maybe a phone, I'll be out of your hair." Frank tapped his chin. The idea of sending Mark off immediately gave him pause. If Dominic's men were still searching the area, Mark could be caught in the crossfire, or worse, inadvertently tip them off. "Nearest town is about 20 miles away," Frank said. "The roads probably aren't cleared yet." "You wouldn't get far on foot," Sarah added. "Plus, you're still hurt. You need at least a day or two of rest." Her tone was resolute, despite their predicament. She didn't seem willing to toss Mark back out into the elements. A tense silence followed. Finally, Frank relented. "All right, you can stay the night." "One night," he emphasized. "But tomorrow we all figure out what's next." He glanced at Sarah, who gave a subtle nod. She likely understood that time was running out for her too. Each extra day they remained in the garage increased the odds of Dominic returning. And if Dominic came back with more than polite questions, their ragtag group, an ex-engineer, a whistleblower, and an injured kid would be hard-pressed to hold him off. They settled into a subdued rhythm. Mark dozed in and out of sleep, clearly exhausted from his ordeal. Sarah resumed her quiet checks of the encrypted data, now and then casting anxious looks at the boarded-up windows. Frank found himself pacing, stirring a restless energy he hadn't felt in years. Maybe it was the old soldier in him, anticipating a fight, or maybe it was a simple, undeniable truth: the walls were closing in, and soon they'd have to break free. Night descended once again, but this time the sky was clear, revealing a blanket of stars overhead. The temperature plummeted further, creating a deafening stillness across the snow-covered expanse. Inside the garage, Frank took the first watch while Sarah and Mark tried to get some sleep. He positioned himself by a high window that afforded him a view of the tree line, the rifle resting across his lap. A single lantern hung from the ceiling, casting flickering shadows that danced across stacks of tires and metal parts. In the hush of the late hour, Frank couldn't help replaying the day's events in his mind. Mark's unexpected arrival underscored how vulnerable their hideout truly was. If a random motorist could stumble onto the property, Dominic Shaw's trained men certainly could. He recalled the last conversation he had had with a corporate security agent years ago, when they'd tried to hush him up about the aerospace crash. Threats, half-promises, and veiled references to opportunities elsewhere had been the script. When he refused to budge, they blacklisted him. The memory made his stomach churn. A sudden movement in the distance drew Frank's attention. He peered through the dim moonlight and thought he saw shadows shifting among the pines. He froze, lifting the rifle and looking through the scope. For a moment, he could have sworn there was a figure just beyond the perimeter of the property, but the shape dissolved into the dark silhouettes of the trees, leaving him uncertain if his eyes were playing tricks on him. His heart pounded regardless. "Stay calm," he muttered to himself. "Could just be a deer." He was about to turn away when the faintest glint of reflection caught his eye like metal or glass. Reflexively, he raised the rifle again, scanning the trees with the scope. There it was, a subtle flash, gone almost as soon as he noticed it. Frank's gut twisted. Could be a camera lens, a binocular glare, or even a sniper scope. He felt a cold sweat begin to form beneath his jacket. Slowly, he reached over to the nearby table and tapped a small metal cup, his prearranged signal for Sarah. Within seconds, Sarah was at his side, pistol in hand, eyes wide with alarm. "What is it?" she whispered. Frank tilted his head toward the window, and Sarah followed his line of sight. They stood there in tense silence, waiting for another sign. But the night remained still, the trees unyielding. I don't see anything, Sarah eventually whispered. Frank lowered the rifle, exhaling through gritted teeth. Might have been my imagination, he conceded, though he didn't fully believe it. Keep your weapon close. Anyway, Sarah nodded, her grip on the pistol whitening her knuckles. She'd already changed from the coat into a simpler sweater and jeans. Easier to move in. You think Dominic's men are out there, she asked. I'd be surprised if they weren't, Frank replied grimly. They might just be scouting, seeing if we're awake or if we'll come out. They're patient, Sarah. They'll wait for us to slip up. A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature settled over them. They stood side by side, scanning the silent horizon. Eventually, well, Sarah whispered, we can't stay here. Not much longer. Frank nodded in agreement, the heaviness in his chest confirming what he already knew. They needed to get out before a standoff became inevitable. Morning brought a faint orange glow that filtered through thin cracks in the garage walls. Frank took the opportunity to walk the perimeter again, looking for footprints or signs of tampering. His breath plumed in the cold air as he trudged through snowdrifts. The makeshift wire and bell alarms remained intact, but that did little to ease his mind. If Dominic's men were truly adept, they could slip around those without disturbing anything. Returning inside, he found Sarah and Mark deep in conversation. Mark, sitting cross-legged on the floor, seemed anxious. I really appreciate what you've done, he was saying, cradling his sling-bound arm. But I don't want to be the reason you guys get hurt. If there's danger coming, maybe I should head out on my own. Sarah shook her head, empathy evident in her gaze. If you walk out unprepared, you'll freeze or starve before you get half a mile, or run into people you can't handle. Frank cleared his throat, announcing his presence. She's right, he said curtly. Look, kid, we're not exactly on vacation here, but we can't just dump you on the roadside. He glanced at Sarah. How's your data ready to move? Sarah inhaled, closing her eyes for a moment. I've done all I can here. Without a stable connection or Thomas's equipment, I can't finalize the proof. We have to reach Colorado. Frank rubbed the back of his neck, eyeing the overhead rafters as though the solution might be written there. We'll need to find a functioning vehicle first. My truck is old, but might handle the snow. Trouble is, it's not exactly inconspicuous. Mark perked up at that. You guys need a discreet way out, he asked. His expression turned thoughtful. Before I ended up here, I noticed an old barn about a mile or so south. Looked like it might have some farm vehicles, maybe something you could use. My grandpa used to say that farm trucks are the best in the snow. Frank raised an eyebrow. The idea of checking another property wasn't ideal, but it could be a chance to grab a more rugged ride, or at least a second vehicle to split their group if needed. Could be worth looking into, he said, rubbing his chin. If it's abandoned, we might find something workable. If it's occupied, though, we'll have to tread carefully. Sarah stood, zipping up her coat. Let's do it quickly. Then, the longer we stay, the higher the risk. Frank didn't argue. He signaled for Sarah to grab whatever gear she needed. Mark wanted to tag along, but Frank insisted he stay put, resting his injured arm. If Dominic's men showed up, Mark could hide or play innocent. The fewer of them out in the open, the better. 15 minutes later, Frank and Sarah were trudging through the snow, armed and alert. The sun was brighter now, turning the landscape into a blinding white vista. Their breath crystallized in the air as they moved in single file, scanning for movement at the tree line. Frank couldn't shake the tension in his shoulders. Something about the previous night's potential sighting nagged at him, a sense that they were being watched, followed. They pressed on, each step a reminder that time was running short and each moment of relative calm could be the last. They trekked south for almost half an hour, the cold air burning their lungs. Snow crunched underfoot with a rhythmic crunch that Sarah found oddly hypnotic. She kept one hand near the pistol holstered at her hip, Frank's old sidearm, while her other hand clutched the duffel strap slung over her shoulder. The duffel still contained the precious external drives, sealed in protective cases. She wouldn't let them out of her sight. Eventually, by June, the terrain dipped and rose, revealing a small valley where a dilapidated barn stood. Its roof sagged under the weight of accumulated snow, and the paint had long since peeled away, exposing weather-beaten boards. Nearby, a partially collapsed fence encircled what might have once been a pasture. The wind rustled through the skeletal remains of corn stalks. Frank signaled for Sarah to halt and crouch. From their vantage point, they could see a battered pickup truck parked near the barn. Its rear tires were half buried in snow, and the passenger door hung slightly ajar. No visible signs of recent activity, but they couldn't be sure. "Stay low," Frank whispered. They approached the barn from the north side, using a row of scraggly bushes for cover. A swirl of wind kicked up loose powder, momentarily obscuring their view. Then, as the air cleared, they heard something, a metallic clang from inside the barn. Sarah's heart thumped. She raised her pistol, exchanging a tense glance with Frank. Whoever was inside was either working on something or rummaging around. Frank pressed a finger to his lips, motioning for her to circle around to the barn's rear while he approached from the front. Sarah swallowed her nerves and obeyed, stepping carefully to avoid crunching any particularly loud patches of ice. Inside, muffled curses reached Sarah's ears as she slipped through a gap in the barn's back wall. She found herself in a dark corridor of sorts, an aisle once used for feeding livestock. Broken barrels, old tools, and heaps of rotting hay cluttered the space. She moved slowly, breathing shallowly to keep quiet. As she neared the central area, the barn opened up. Shafts of light poured through missing planks in the roof, illuminating dust motes in the air. The battered pickup sat with its hood propped open. A man wearing a heavy jacket stood bent over the engine, cursing at a rusty wrench. He was alone. Sarah trained her pistol on him, uncertain whether this was a threat or just another random traveler. She was about to speak when she heard a rustling from the opposite side. Frank emerged, shotgun at the ready. The man jumped, dropping the wrench with a clang. He whirled around, hands in the air, face twisted in shock. "Whoa! Whoa, don't shoot!" he shouted, voice echoing in the cavernous barn. Frank's eyes narrowed. "Who are you and what are you doing here?" The man visibly gulped. "Name's Dale Ramsey. My property's about 2 miles east, but my tractor's kaput. Came here hoping to salvage this old truck. Maybe get it running. I'm not looking for trouble." His voice trembled, and sweat glistened on his forehead. Despite the frigid air, Sarah glanced at Frank. The story sounded plausible. "We're not thieves either," she said softly, lowering her gun just a fraction. "We need a working vehicle ourselves. Our situation's urgent." Dale looked between them, eyes brimming with fear and confusion. "Look, I just want to get home. My family's freezing. Power lines are down. If I can get this heap started, maybe I can tow some supplies." "You two some kind of fugitives or what?" Frank hesitated. He'd rarely had to lie to a fellow Montanan. "We've got folks counting on us too," he said. "We all need something from this truck." Awkward silence filled the barn's dusty air. The three of them stood in a loose triangle, Frank with the shotgun, Sarah with her pistol, and Dale unarmed except for a wrench on the ground. Snow drifted in through cracks in the barn wall, adding a faint rustling backdrop. Finally, Sarah broke the tension by holstering her weapon. "Dale, we're not looking to hurt anyone," she said, keeping her tone calm but firm. "We just need to get out of this area fast. We've got people after us." Dale slowly lowered his raised hands, relief flooding his features. "Well, you picked a hell of a time. This storm's messed everything up. I've been trying to fix this truck since yesterday morning." He nudged the engine with his toe, eyes flicking over the old spark plugs, the corroded battery cables. "It's not in great shape, but maybe with the right know-how, it'll run." Frank shifted his shotgun to his other hand, glancing at the engine. "I'm a mechanic. Let me take a look." He motioned Dale aside, who happily yielded. Leaning in, Frank fiddled with the distributor cap, then tapped the carburetor. Rust and grime coated nearly every component. He looked at Sarah, Could be salvageable, but it'll take some work. She nodded, eyes reflecting a glimmer of hope. Dale grabbed a rag from the floor and rubbed his hands clean. If you can get it running, maybe we can strike a deal. You let me borrow it after you're done, or you give me something for my trouble. Sarah inwardly cringed at the idea of bartering under the circumstances, but she supposed it was only fair. Dale had found the truck first. After all, if we get it fixed, we'll drop it back with you, she offered. We just need to head south. Once we're clear, we'll call you with the location. Assuming we can find a working phone, Frank muttered, grabbing a rusted toolbox from the barn floor. Dale, you have family, right? We're not trying to leave you in a jam. Dale nodded, his features clouding with concern. A wife and 2 kids. The older one has asthma. This cold's killing her. We lost power, and the roads are a nightmare. That's why I came looking for spare parts. Saw this barn, figured it might have something usable. Frank's face softened. All right then, he said, letting out a breath. We'll do this together. You help me find what I need in here, like a working battery and maybe some wiring, and I'll try to get the truck running. In return, once we've done what we need to do, we'll get it back to you. Or at least we'll drop it in a place you can retrieve. Sarah shifted on her feet, glancing at the barn's entrance. The possibility of Dominic's men being anywhere near made her uneasy. We don't have a lot of time, she said. Someone could show up looking for us. Dale raised an eyebrow. Who you in trouble with the law, worse? Frank replied gravely, avoiding further detail. Let's get to work. He tossed a pair of gloves to Dale and directed him to look for any spare battery or parts around the barn. Sarah took up a lookout position by the open door, eyes scanning the snow-covered surroundings. As Frank began disassembling corroded components under the hood, she couldn't shake the prickling sensation that somewhere. Dominic Shaw's cold eyes were tracking their every move. They spent the better part of an hour elbow-deep in grease, rust, and the bitter chill. Between the 3 of them, they scavenged a half-decent battery from an old tractor parked behind a stack of hay bales, along with some spark plugs that, while worn, appeared less corroded than the ones in the truck. Frank tinkered with the carburetor, cursing under his breath every few minutes. The air smelled of stale gasoline and old manure. Snow continued to swirl through the barn's broken slats, collecting in small drifts along the floor. Sarah kept a vigilant watch at the barn entrance, scanning the horizon. Now and then, she caught herself jumping at shadows or the rustle of tree branches in the wind. Her nerves were frayed. Each shift of the wind or creak of the barn made her grip her pistol tighter. Dale occasionally glanced in her direction, but he was smart enough not to pepper her with questions about the alleged pursuers. At last, Frank exhaled, stepping back from the engine. All right, he muttered, wiping his forehead with a rag. Moment of truth. He signaled to Dale Psuyam, who slid into the driver's seat with trembling fingers. Dale turned the key. The engine coughed, sputtered, and died. Frank grimaced, adjusting a hose clamp under the hood. Try again. This time, the engine stuttered before roaring to life, belching a cloud of black smoke from the tailpipe. Dale let out a whoop of disbelief, and Sarah felt a surge of relief, even a rumbling. Smoke-belching clunker was better than nothing. Frank tapped the hood. We should let it run for a minute, clear out the gunk. Fuel lines might be blocked or sludged, but if it keeps going, we're in business. Dale grinned, stepping out of the cab. I can't believe it. You're a magician. Old man. Frank gave him a mildly annoyed look. Just a mechanic who's seen a lot of broken junk in my time. Then he cast a glance towards Sarah. We'll take this back to the garage, pick up Mark, and head out as soon as we can. Sarah's relief mixed with a flicker of worry. What about you, Dale? She asked. Will you be okay here on foot? Dale nodded, though his expression turned serious. I'll manage. I know these woods. I'll see if there's any leftover bits or other parts I can bring back to my own place. You said you'd get the truck back to me eventually. Right. Sarah gave a determined nod. We will. It's a promise. If we can't bring it back ourselves, we'll hide it somewhere safe and let you know. She extended a hand, and Dale shook it firmly. They were interrupted by a distant sound, the unmistakable rumble of engines. It was faint but growing louder. A jolt of fear shot through Sarah. Frank's features tightened. "That's not good," he said. Quickly, he shut the hood, motioning for Dale to kill the engine. The barn plunged into an uneasy silence broken only by their ragged breathing. Sarah darted to the doorway and scanned the horizon. Far off, near the main road, dark shapes formed, vehicles, several of them moving in a coordinated line. Her stomach dropped. "We have to move," she hissed. "Now." Frank met Dale's eyes. "Get out of sight. We'll lead them away if they come this direction." Dale looked torn, but nodded. "Go, go," he urged. Frank and Sarah slid into the pickup, hearts pounding, and fired up the engine again. The ancient vehicle roared, wheels spinning in the snow before gaining traction. As they sped out of the barn, Sarah caught a final glimpse of Dale crouched behind a stack of lumber, eyes wide. Outside, the wind whipped snow into blinding sheets, but she could just make out the silhouettes of SUVs approaching in the distance. The chase was on again. Sarah gripped the dashboard as the battered farm truck thundered across the snowy field, its tires churning up icy ruts. The engine groaned in protest, but Frank refused to slow down. With each jolt, the ancient pickup seemed ready to disintegrate under the strain. Yet, adrenaline propelled them forward. Behind them, the swirling white haze made it difficult to pinpoint their pursuer's location, but the roars of multiple engines remained audible, growing louder with every passing second. They burst through a rotten fence line with a splintering crunch, careening onto a narrow path that snaked back toward Frank's garage. "Keep your eyes peeled," Frank barked, knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. "They could flank us at any moment." Sarah nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She twisted around, trying to see through the cracked rear window. The horizon was a blur of shifting snowdrifts. Then, for an instant, she glimpsed a dark SUV cresting a small ridge about 200 yards behind them. "They're here," she shouted, heart thundering. Frank pressed the gas pedal down harder, the truck jerking violently as it pitched over uneven ground. The battered suspension squealed in protest. Their best hope, Sarah realized, was to lead Dominic Shaw's men away from the barn and from Dale. The memory of Dale crouched behind the lumber stack flashed through her mind. She hoped he'd find a way to hide until the danger passed. A pair of SUVs emerged from the swirling snow, headlights glaring like predatory eyes. The vehicles advanced in formation, clearly well coordinated. They were closing the distance fast. Sarah could see the glint of tinted windows, and behind them, the silhouettes of men likely armed to the teeth. The pickup simply wasn't built for outrunning state-of-the-art sport utility vehicles. "This thing isn't exactly winning a race," Sarah muttered, breath quickening. Frank's jaw clenched. "Not trying to outrun them," he said. "Just need to hold them off until we reach the tree line near the cabin. More cover there." He yanked the steering wheel, sending the truck into a sideways skid around a drift. For a harrowing moment, and the vehicle teetered as if ready to flip, but Frank expertly corrected at the last second, the truck slamming back onto all four wheels. Snow sprayed like a tidal wave behind them, momentarily obscuring the SUV's view. Sarah fumbled with the pistol in her lap. "If they catch up, we might have to fight," she warned. The idea of another firefight made her stomach twist in knots, but the memory of Dominic Shaw's hollow stare fueled her resolve. She refused to let him drag her back or destroy the evidence she carried. Behind them, one SUV burst through the powder, headlights flickering as it bounced over rough terrain. Sarah's pulse hammered. She thought she could make out the shape of someone leaning from the passenger window, possibly aiming a rifle or camera. "We've got company," she shouted, bracing herself. Almost on cue, a deafening crack split the air. A bullet pinged off the truck's tailgate, sending shards of metal scattering. Frank cursed, swerving hard to the left. They sped toward a thicket of pines, the branches stark and skeletal against the winter sky. The truck rocked as it trampled small saplings, pine needles clawing at the windows. Another shot rang out, punching through the tailgate again, this time lodging in the rear panel. Sarah ducked, heart racing, and returned fire through the back window. Her first shot went wide, but it forced the SUV to veer slightly, buying them precious seconds. Frank gritted his teeth, scanning for an opening. Ahead, the tree line deepened, offering a chance to lose their pursuers if they could navigate the maze of trunks without crashing. They barreled into the forest, the truck's engine shrieking at the sudden change in terrain. Snow-laden branches slapped against the windshield, each impact jarring Sarah's nerves. The roar of the SUVs faded momentarily, muffled by the dense pines. Frank slowed the truck just enough to avoid smashing headlong into a tree. He breathed heavily, sweat beading on his brow despite the freezing air. "It's too thick in here for them to maintain speed," he muttered, half to Sarah and half to himself. "But we're not exactly safe. They'll try to box us in." Sarah craned her neck to look through the back window. She saw fleeting glimpses of headlights dancing among the trees, weaving in and out as Dominic's men searched for a path. She thanked whatever stroke of luck had given them a slight lead. "We need to get to your place," she said urgently. "Mark's still there, and we have to load your truck with supplies if we're heading for Colorado." Frank nodded, scanning the darkness ahead. "We'll cut around the ridge. If we're lucky, we can circle back to the main road near the cabin. The old truck can't handle these woods for long." He glanced at the fuel gauge barely above empty, an unsettling reminder that they had little margin for error. A fresh crack of gunfire shattered the relative silence. Sarah winced as a bullet tore through the passenger side mirror, sending glass fragments showering across her lap. Frank let out a strangled hiss, yanking the wheel. The pickup narrowly missed a thick trunk. He twisted around, spotting an SUV that had managed to follow their path, bouncing over logs and shallow ditches. Its windshield was partially smashed by low-hanging branches, but the driver was relentless. With grim determination, Sarah fired another shot out the shattered rear window. She aimed low, hoping to hit a tire, though she couldn't tell if she'd made contact. The SUV swerved enough to lose momentum, giving them a bit more breathing room. "Out of bullets soon," she muttered under her breath. "We can't keep this up." Frank skidded onto a narrow footpath, the truck's front bumper scraping a boulder that jutted from the snowbank. Metal shrieked, but the vehicle soldiered on. "Hold on," he warned, slamming on the accelerator. They lurched forward, the tires spinning for a harrowing second before catching traction. The pickup shot up a small incline, bursting through a tangle of undergrowth onto an overgrown logging trail. Sarah caught sight of an opening in the trees, and beyond that, the faint outline of rooftops, the edge of Frank's property. Relief and dread mingled in her chest. Returning to the garage felt like stepping into the crosshairs of a final showdown. But Mark was there, and they needed him and the evidence. She exhaled shakily. "We're almost home," Frank grunted. "Let's hope Dominic's men aren't already waiting for us." He navigated the final stretch, the truck groaning as it broke free from the forest line. Sunlight glared off the pristine snow around the cabin and garage, illuminating the battered old sign that read Garrett's Repair. For a brief heartbeat, everything looked eerily peaceful. But peace was an illusion. As they rumbled toward the garage, Sarah spotted fresh tire tracks, multiple sets. Her stomach twisted into a knot. Frank tensed, scanning the property. "Mark," he yelled, throwing the truck into park. Smoke poured from the hood, and the engine rattled ominously as though ready to give out. No response came. The garage door stood slightly ajar, revealing darkness within. Sarah raised her pistol, exchanging a look of grim resolve with Frank. They had come too far to turn back now. Frank edged toward the half-open garage door, shotgun in hand. The winter air was brutally cold on his cheeks, and the tension in his chest was almost suffocating. Sarah followed a step behind, pistol at the ready, scanning every shadow for signs of movement. Their boots crunched loudly on the snow, broadcasting their approach no matter how carefully they stepped. The garage interior was dim, the only light seeping in from the door's narrow opening. The familiar smell of motor oil and metal shavings hung in the air, but now it was tainted by something else, fear. Sarah's eyes adjusted slowly, picking out shapes in the gloom, the old workbench, stacks of crates, and the cot where Mark had been resting. But Mark was nowhere to be seen. Neither were Dominic Shaw's men, though she could sense their presence somehow, like an animal senses predators nearby. Frank motioned for her to wait near the entrance. Then, with deliberate caution, he moved deeper into the garage. A muffled thump echoed from the back storage area. Sarah tensed, heart pounding. She aimed her pistol at the darkness. Frank paused, exchanging a questioning glance with her. Then he inched closer, finger on the shotgun's trigger. A sudden blur of movement erupted from behind a stack of tires. Sarah jerked her aim upward, only to see Mark stumbling forward, hands raised in surrender. His face was pale, sweat beading on his forehead despite the chill. A bandage still wrapped his injured arm. He looked terrified. "They're gone," he managed, voice cracking. "I hid when they came. They tore through the place. Called for you two. When you didn't show, they left. Said they'd be back." Frank's grip on the shotgun loosened slightly, though his expression remained grim. "How long ago?" he asked. Mark's eyes darted around as though expecting the men to reappear at any moment. Maybe 15 minutes. They were searching for something. Talking about a woman named Sarah. They kept saying they knew you had evidence. Sarah exhaled shakily, adrenaline coursing through her veins. Dominic Shaw's men must have found the property deserted and decided to regroup. "Did they take anything?" she asked, moving toward the small corner where she'd kept her laptop and drives. Mark shook his head. "I think they tried. They smashed open some crates, rummaged through that old desk, but I guess they didn't find what they wanted." Relief flooded her as she spotted the tangle of electronics still concealed behind a heavy toolbox. Quickly, she checked the duffel bag's contents. Nothing missing. She clutched it to her chest. "Good," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Frank looked around, assessing the damage. A few items were scattered, a crate overturned. "This is going to get ugly real fast," he said, jaw tightening. "They'll be back with a plan. They probably saw the tracks leading into the woods. Know we're close." Mark leaned against the wall, wincing from his injury. "Please tell me you have a plan," he said, desperation edging his voice. "I can't outrun those guys. Not like this." Frank exchanged a look with Sarah, the weight of the situation bearing down on them. "We've still got my old truck out back. It's no luxury ride, but it'll get us moving. Question is, where do we go that they won't follow?" Sarah pressed her lips together, thinking of Colorado and Thomas Bridges. "We have to try," she said, her resolve solidifying. "This place isn't safe anymore, and we can't wait for them to trap us here." Frank nodded. "Then we pack what we can carry, load up the truck, and get on the road." He paused, looking at Mark. "Kid, you're coming with us." Mark blinked, clearly relieved. "Thank you. I'll do whatever you say." Without another word, they began gathering supplies, each move weighed down by the knowledge that time was running dangerously short. The back of Frank's old pickup was soon loaded with boxes of food, extra ammunition, and a few battered tools. Sarah tucked her duffel bag containing the precious drives under the passenger seat, ensuring it was within arm's reach. Mark climbed into the rear cabin, his bandaged arm cradled against his chest. Though still weak, he insisted on helping where he could, passing supplies up to Sarah with shaky determination. Frank double-checked the engine, muttering a string of curses at the decades-old machinery. The truck's body was a testament to years of rust, with dents in the fenders and a spiderweb of cracks running across the windshield. But Frank had kept the mechanical systems in decent shape. "She'll run," he assured them, though the tension in his voice betrayed his doubts. Sarah took a moment to scan the horizon. Gray clouds were rolling in again, threatening another round of snow. The bitter wind whipped her hair against her cheeks. She couldn't help but think of Dale Ramsey, the man they'd left at the barn. She hoped he was safe. But there was no time for detours. Their mission was clear: get to Colorado, find Thomas, and finalize the evidence. Only then could they blow the whistle on global trust once and for all. Mark settled into the back seat, face pinched with pain and fear. "I've never been hunted before," he murmured. Feels like something out of a war movie. Frank fired up the engine, the truck rattling to life with a roar. "Let's hope it doesn't get that dramatic," he said, though the look in his eyes suggested he expected the opposite. He shifted into gear, and the truck lurched forward, tires crunching over frozen snow. They navigated past the old fence line, heading for the main road that cut through the valley. Sarah clutched her pistol, scanning the rear-view mirror for any sign of black SUVs. The first mile was eerily calm. The road, partially cleared by a local plow, allowed them to pick up speed. Rays blurred past in a monochrome swirl of white and brown. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest, each new bend bringing the possibility of an ambush. Yet, no headlights appeared in pursuit. "Maybe they're still regrouping," Mark offered, voice hopeful. "Or they lost us in the forest." Frank kept his gaze fixed ahead. "Don't let your guard down," he warned, tapping the steering wheel. "Dominic Shaw's not going to just give up. If they're not right behind us, they're planning something else. Maybe a roadblock further along." Sarah recalled the stored data in her laptop, the ledger, the log files, the damning transactions. The entire saga hinged on them getting to Thomas Bridges. If Dominic or his men intercepted them, the truth would be lost. "We'll drive as far as we can without stopping," she said, stealing a glance at Frank. "Your truck can handle the distance." "Right," he sighed. "It'll handle it better than that old barn truck. But we're not exactly riding in a bulletproof Humvee." An edge of worry crept into his voice. "Still, it's our only shot." Minutes stretched into an hour. The narrow two-lane road merged into a wider highway, fringed by pines weighed down with fresh snow. The wind had picked up, howling across open stretches. Mark dozed off intermittently in the back seat, exhaustion overcoming his nerves. Sarah fought the urge to close her eyes as well, reminding herself that vigilance was their lifeline. Just as they rounded a gentle bend, the radio, barely functional, crackled with static. Frank tapped the old dial, and for an instant, a voice flickered through advisory remains. In effect, the signal vanished, replaced by white noise. Sarah frowned, a chill running down her spine. She had the unsettling sense that something else lay ahead. Beyond the curve of the highway, something far worse than a snowstorm. They encountered the first sign of trouble a few miles later, a pair of abandoned vehicles blocking both lanes of the highway, noses almost touching in a makeshift barricade. One was a pickup with its hood open, steam arising from within. The other, a station wagon, had its trunk left ajar, groceries spilled on the pavement. No movement, no people in sight. The scene felt too neatly arranged, like a stage set waiting for its actors. Frank slowed the truck, cursing under his breath. "This could be a trap," he muttered. Sarah nodded, scanning the edges of the road, the clusters of pines that stood like silent sentinels on either side. Mark craned his neck from the back, alarmed. "You think Dominic's men did this?" "Wouldn't put it past them," Frank said. He let the truck idle about 50 yards from the blockade. The engine chugged, a thin plume of exhaust drifting into the frigid air. "But we can't just sit here. We need to clear a path or find another route." Sarah squinted, trying to see if there was a possible detour. The roadside was thick with drifts, and beyond that, the forest was too dense to navigate without risking a crash. "We might move to one of those cars if the keys are inside," she suggested. "Or push it aside with the truck, but that'll make a racket." They weighed their options in a tense silence. Then Mark let out a gasp. "I see someone," he pointed to the station wagon. Sure enough, a figure was hunched near the open trunk, half hidden by the side panel. Frank's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "Stay low," he instructed. Sarah slid her hand to the door handle, pistol ready. Slowly, Frank inched the truck forward until they were close enough to call out. "Hey," he shouted, "you need help." The figure startled and emerged into view, a woman, middle-aged, bundled in a large coat. Her face was lined with panic. She raised her hands in a placating gesture. "Don't shoot, my car overheated," she called back, voice trembling. I've been stranded here for hours. The other truck tried to help me, But now it won't start either. Sarah exchanged a skeptical glance with Frank. The scene seemed too perfect, too convenient. But the woman's trembling lips and reddened cheeks suggested she'd been out in the cold for a while. "Are you alone?" Sarah asked, stepping out of the passenger door cautiously. She kept her pistol in hand but angled behind her leg. The woman nodded, voice quavering. "Yes, I'm alone. I was headed to see my sister for Christmas." Then the storm, she trailed off, eyes darting to Mark's bandaged arm and Frank's hardened expression. Frank glanced under the hood of the station wagon. The engine was indeed steaming, the radiator cap hissing dangerously. Meanwhile, Sarah edged around the vehicles, scanning the tree line. She felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up as if unseen eyes were watching. She couldn't rule out the possibility that Dominic's men had staged this entire scenario to lure them into stopping. Mark, still inside the truck, rolled down the window. "What if we try jumping the pickup?" he suggested, pointing to Frank's battered vehicle. "Might get it out of the way." Frank considered it, shooting Sarah a questioning look. Time was slipping away, and the longer they lingered, the greater the chance of an ambush. But leaving a stranded woman behind, if she was truly in trouble, went against his instincts. After a moment of heavy deliberation, he nodded. "All right, we'll give it one shot. If it doesn't start, we're pushing these cars aside and moving on. We can't afford to stay longer than that." Sarah exhaled, nerves thrumming. She motioned for the woman to stand back, and Frank maneuvered their truck closer, readying the jumper cables. The sense of impending danger pressed around them like the cold air, unseen but omnipresent. Frank hooked up the jumper cables, muttering instructions under his breath. The stranded woman, who introduced herself as Nancy Harper, stayed a respectful distance away, arms wrapped tightly around herself. Sarah tried to read the woman's eyes for any telltale signs of deception, but all she saw was a haggard face etched with worry. Maybe Nancy was just another unfortunate soul caught in the storm. Still, Sarah kept her pistol at the ready, out of Nancy's direct view. Mark gingerly climbed out of the truck to hold a flashlight. Though the daylight was sufficient, he grimaced each time he moved his injured arm, but he insisted on being useful. Snow crunched underfoot, and as Frank gave the signal to start the engine in Nancy's pickup, it rumbled, coughed, then died. A second attempt yielded the same result. "Fuel line might be frozen," Frank declared, pulling the cables off. "We won't get it running without more time and better conditions." Nancy's face fell. "I was hoping," she began, voice cracking. Then her gaze flicked between Frank's truck and Sarah's guarded posture. "Could you at least give me a ride to the next town? I'm freezing out here." Frank and Sarah exchanged a heavy look. Their truck was already loaded down, and every seat accounted for. Still, turning Nancy away felt cruel. Mark gave a weak shrug. "We can make room in the back, I guess, or she could ride up front with Sarah." Nancy's eyes glimmered with gratitude, tears threatening to spill. "Thank you," she whispered. "I thought I was going to die out here." Before they could respond, a chorus of engines echoed in the distance. Sarah's heart lurched. She whirled around, scanning the highway behind them. Through the swirling snow, a convoy of black SUVs came into view, 3, maybe 4 vehicles, traveling in tight formation. There was no question in Sarah's mind Dominic Shaw's men had found them. Frank tore the jumper cables from the pickup, casting them aside. "We're out of time," he barked, sprinting back to his truck. Sarah grabbed Nancy by the elbow, pulling her along. "Get in now," she shouted. Mark had already scrambled into the back seat, wincing with every motion. Nancy hesitated only a second before practically diving into the passenger side beside Sarah. The battered pickup roared to life as Frank jammed the accelerator. With a spray of slush, they plowed through the gap between the stranded truck and station wagon, clipping a rear bumper in the process. Metal screeched, but they broke free, lurching onto the open highway. Behind them, the SUVs quickened their pace, headlights piercing the wintry haze. "Get down," Sarah yelled, leaning out the window with her pistol. The cold air slapped her face, and the wind stung her eyes. She fired 2 shots at the closest SUV, the sound reverberating across the empty road. She had no idea if she hit anything, but the SUV swerved slightly. Its companions, however, maneuvered around it, continuing the pursuit. Nancy let out a cry of terror, clutching the dashboard. "Who are they?" she screamed, voice breaking. Frank's jaw was set like iron. "Long story," he growled, wrenching the steering wheel to avoid a spin on the icy asphalt. The truck fishtailed, and for a split second, Sarah thought they might skid into a ditch. Frank wrestled the vehicle back on course, tires squealing. The SUVs closed in, now only a dozen yards behind them. A muzzle flash lit the interior of the leading SUV. Bullets ricocheted off the truck's rear fender, one punching through the tailgate and embedding itself in the floor. Nancy shrieked, curling into a protective ball. Mark grit his teeth, hooking an arm around the seat to brace himself. Sarah steadied her pistol, returning fire. The thunderous exchange of gunshots shattered the air, flinging shards of metal and glass across the frozen highway. Tires squealed against the slick road, the battered pickup swerving wildly as Frank tried to evade the gunfire. Adrenaline surged through Sarah's veins, every muscle screaming with tension. In the passenger seat, Nancy cowered low, her breath coming in panicked gasps. Behind them, Mark pressed himself against the back seat, trying to keep his bandaged arms safe from further harm. Sarah's bullets forced the nearest SUV to back off momentarily, but two more flanked it, maintaining relentless pursuit. The echo of gunfire reverberated off the trees lining the highway, each muzzle flash illuminating the swirling snow. Frank spotted a narrow side road up ahead and jerked the wheel to the right, hoping to throw off their pursuers. The truck careened onto the smaller route, almost tipping as it skidded over a patch of ice. One SUV attempted the same maneuver but lost traction, plowing into a snowbank with a muffled crash. The remaining vehicles continued the chase, though, and Sarah knew it was only a matter of time before Dominic Shaw himself appeared to finish what he started. They thundered along the winding road, occasional pines or crumbling fences whipping past. The engine roared in protest. If it died now, they'd be sitting ducks. Another shot rang out, punching through the rear window. Glass fragments exploded inward, slicing across Mark's shoulder and sprinkling the cabin with tiny shards. He cried out, ducking low. Nancy's terrified sobs mingled with the gunshots and roaring engine. Frank pressed the gas pedal to the floor. "Hold on," he shouted, eyes scanning the roadside for any cover or hidden turn. Up ahead, the road curved sharply around a frozen ravine. A single guardrail, half buried in snow, was all that stood between them and a deadly plunge. The truck fishtailed as he wrestled the steering wheel, narrowly avoiding a slide off the edge. Behind them, an SUV attempted the turn at high speed, tires losing purchase on the ice. The vehicle slammed into the guardrail with a teeth-rattling crunch, teetering precariously. For a moment, Sarah thought it might roll into the ravine, but it remained wedged at an angle, steam pouring from its hood. One less pursuer. But how many more behind them, Sarah? Mark gasped. "Are we really going to make it to Colorado like this?" Sarah wished she had a reassuring answer. Instead, she peeked out the shattered rear window, searching for any sign of the next SUV. The road behind them disappeared into a swirl of white. For a heartbeat, she hoped they'd lost their pursuers. Then two headlights pierced the mist, barreling forward at a terrifying speed. Frank cursed under his breath. "They're persistent bastards. I'll give them that." A side trail emerged on the left, barely more than a snow-covered footpath, but Frank took the risk, hoping it might lead to some advantage. The truck rocked and lurched as they veered off the main route, plunging into a corridor of trees. Branches scraped the sides, painting fresh scratches in the battered paint. Nancy let out another startled cry. Clutching the door handle, the faint shape of a small bridge came into view, spanning a frozen creek. Frank aimed for it, eyes narrowed. If the creek's ice was thick enough, they might cross safely. If not, well, it was a gamble they had to take. He guided the truck onto the wooden boards, the planks groaning under the weight. Snow cascaded from the beams overhead, clouding the windshield. Another bullet whizzed past, striking the wooden railing and splintering it. They emerged on the other side, the bridge swaying ominously behind them. Then, as if delivered by fate, the last SUV tried to follow but veered too far left. Its front wheel slipped off the edge, the heavy vehicle careening into the creek with a thunderous crash. Snow, water, and chunks of ice exploded around it. Frank didn't waste a second, gunning the engine onward. For the moment, at least, their road was clear. A strained silence settled over them as Frank continued down the winding path, the battered truck rattling with each bump. At last, he found a larger road again, perhaps an old county road, and followed it until the adrenaline began to ebb. Sarah checked the rearview mirror repeatedly, expecting more headlights to appear, but the landscape behind them remained empty. Nancy finally lifted her head, tears streaking her cheeks. "What the hell was that about?" she asked, voice still quivering. "Are you all criminals or something? Did you steal from those men?" Mark shook his head, wiping blood from a small cut on his ear where the glass had grazed him. They're, they're after Sarah and Frank, I guess," he said haltingly. "But none of us are criminals." Frank's eyes remained on the road. He inhaled slowly before speaking, the words weighted by weariness. "They're corporate security. Real nasty piece of work. We have something they want." He glanced at Sarah, who clutched her duffel protectively. "I'd explain more, but it won't make much difference right now. We're all targets by association." Nancy let out a shaky breath, clearly in shock. I, I was just trying to see my sister for Christmas. This is insane." Sarah's gaze softened. "I'm sorry, you got caught up in a mess you had nothing to do with." She reached out and gently touched Nancy's arm. "But if you stay with us, at least you won't be alone in the cold." Nancy managed a nod, though her eyes were still haunted. This truck bumped along the road, passing a half-buried sign indicating a state highway lay somewhere ahead. Frank slowed a bit, trying to read the numbers. The paint was faded, but it looked like they were on the cusp of crossing into Idaho. Beyond that, Colorado was still hours, maybe a day of driving away. "We need to refuel," Frank said grimly. "This old tank's running close to empty. We also need to patch up Mark's wounds before infection sets in." Sarah agreed, though dread curled in her stomach at the thought of stopping. Every moment they lingered offered Dominic Shaw another chance to catch up. "Any gas station out here is going to be deserted or locked down for the winter," she said, biting her lip. "But maybe we'll get lucky." Luck, it turned out, was a fickle concept. 5 miles later, they spotted a small general store and gas station combo perched at the edge of a frozen lake. A hand-painted sign read Lakeview Supply, though the place looked far from inviting. The windows were boarded up, the pumps possibly empty or out of order. Yet, their options were limited. Frank parked near the pumps, stepping out into the knee-deep snow. "Stay alert," he warned. Sarah and Mark exited as well, while Nancy remained in the truck, arms wrapped around herself. Frank tried the pumps, only to find them without power. His frustration showed in the tight lines around his mouth. Sarah picked up on a faint odor of gasoline. "Wait," she said, stepping around the side of the building. A small shed stood behind the store, padlocked shut. A battered sign overhead read fuel storage. She tried the lock, finding it rusted but resilient. Frank joined her, producing a crowbar from the truck's cluttered toolbox. With a few forceful jabs, the lock snapped off. Inside were several barrels labeled unleaded and diesel. A wave of relief passed between them. They'd need to siphon the gas, but it was better than nothing. Mark grabbed a rubber hose, and soon they had rigged a makeshift setup to transfer gasoline into a portable can. The pungent smell filled the frosty air. Nancy, still in the passenger seat, pressed her forehead against the cold window, watching them work. She looked as if she might never feel safe again. Time felt painfully slow as they siphoned base from the storage barrels. Frank's gloved hands trembled from the cold and the residual adrenaline. Mark, his face pinched with pain, helped stabilize the canister, trying to ignore the throb in his injured arm. Sarah kept watch, pistol in hand, scanning the road and nearby woods for any sign of movement. Her breath came in quick, visible puffs, each exhalation a reminder of how vulnerable they were out here. Nancy eventually stepped out of the truck, rubbing her hands together for warmth. She peered at the boarded-up windows of the general store. "Do you think there's anything inside we can use?" she asked, her voice still shaky but more lucid than before. "Food, medicine." Maybe Frank glanced at the store. "Worth a look. But be quick. This place was probably shut down for the winter. Could be empty." "I'll help." Sarah volunteered, eager to get Nancy out of the biting cold and maybe out of her own swirling thoughts. "Frank, keep an eye on the gate. Mark, watch our backs." They crunched through the snow to the store's front porch. One of the boards on the windows was loose, and Sarah pried it aside. The glass behind it was intact but dusty, the interior barely visible. She tried the door, half expecting it to be locked, but it swung open with a groan. The smell of stale air and moth-eaten fabric wafted out. Inside, the space was small, narrow aisles lined with empty shelves. A few scattered canned goods remained, most well past their expiration date. A layer of dust covered the counters. Nancy flicked the switch on a wall, but nothing happened. The power was obviously cut. "At least it's not freezing in here," she noted, drawing her coat tighter. They swept through the aisles, shining a flashlight in the dim corners. Sarah found a half-full bottle of pain reliever, some antiseptic wipes, and a roll of gauze behind the counter. "This will help with Mark's injuries," she murmured, pocketing them. Nancy grabbed a couple of soup cans and a dusty water bottle. "Better than nothing," she said. Voice still shaky, a sudden clatter from the back storage room made them both jump. Sarah spun, flashlight beam bobbing. She motioned for Nancy to stay behind her. Carefully, she pushed open the door to the back area, a cramped space with a sagging ceiling and a single overhead bulb that no longer worked. Cardboard boxes were stacked haphazardly, some torn open. Sarah tensed, half expecting an animal or, worse, a person. But there was only an ancient broom that had toppled off a shelf, presumably dislodged by a shifting box. Her heart still pounded as she exhaled in relief. "False alarm," she said softly. Nancy nodded, though her eyes remained wide. They rummaged quickly through the bins, finding little of value: some old fishing lures, a few expired packets of dried soup mix. Sarah grabbed what looked salvageable, stuffing the items into a plastic bag. When they returned to the front, Nancy let out a relieved sigh. "Not much, but it's something," she said, gazing at the pale sunlight filtering through the dusty window. "Better hurry back." They stepped outside to find Frank waiting near the truck, gas canister now partially full. Mark stood at a shorted distance, rifle balanced awkwardly in his uninjured arm. Neither man spoke, but the tension in their postures was obvious. Sarah could almost hear the unspoken worry at any moment. Dominic Shaw's convoy could reappear, and their frantic escape would resume. With the extra fuel now transferred into Frank's truck, they decided to press their luck and see if the old building had a rear exit that could lead to a safer route. Mark, still wincing from his injuries, climbed back into the passenger seat with Nancy, while Sarah and Frank ventured around the side of the store. They found a rusted fence, partially collapsed, leading to a narrow trail that meandered through the snowy pines. Frank pointed. "Might be a Forest Service road back there. Looping around the lake? Could be a shortcut or a dead end." Sarah peered into the dimness of the trees. The day's light was already waning, casting long shadows. "We can't afford to get stuck again." "But if we stay on the highway, we're sitting ducks." Frank nodded. "All right, let's at least take a look." He led the way, boots crunching over frozen patches of earth. Sarah followed closely, scanning their surroundings. The hush of the forest felt oppressive, broken only by the soft hiss of wind against pine needles. After several minutes, they emerged into a small clearing. Indeed, a narrow, unpaved track emerged from the left, curving out of sight. A weathered sign read Forest Erd 2A. Sarah's heart rose a fraction. This might take us around the main roads. Help us avoid Dominic's men for a while. Frank studied the sign, remembering old logging maps from his younger days. I think this road eventually merges with a county route heading south, he mused. If we're lucky, we can circle back to a main highway closer to the Idaho border. They returned to the truck to share their find. Mark, looking pale, nodded enthusiastically. Let's do it. Anything to avoid another shootout. Nancy glanced at the battered station wagon and pickup that still blocked the highway in the distance. She swallowed hard. I hope nobody else wanders out here like I did, she murmured, a quiet guilt shadowing her eyes. Sarah gave her a reassuring pat on the shoulder, though her own confidence was waning. Frank maneuvered the truck around the general store, plowing through drifted snow until they reached the fence line. With some effort, he nudged aside a section of broken fencing, creating enough space for the truck to pass. They inched onto the unpaved trail, branches scraping the sides of the vehicle like skeletal fingers. Sarah kept watch out the window, half expecting headlights to appear behind them. Despite the uneven ground, progress felt surprisingly steady. The forest closed in around them, muffling outside noise. An hour slipped by. The tension in the truck was palpable but somewhat diminished by the lack of immediate threats. Nancy dozed off, head resting against the window, tears still glistening on her lashes. Mark tried to adjust his sling, biting back a groan each time the truck jolted over a rut. Sarah used the lull to connect her laptop to a portable battery pack. She wanted to check the integrity of the data, ensuring nothing had corrupted during the frantic relocations. Every beep and click felt like an echo of her own heartbeat. If this evidence were lost, so would be their entire reason for running. The screen lit up, lines of code reflecting in her eyes. The drive's encryption remained intact, the folder structure complete, a small victory in a sea of turmoil. Frank glanced over, concern etched in his features. We're deep in the woods now. Gonna be dark soon. Keep an eye out for a clearing or somewhere we can camp. Sarah felt a knot tighten in her stomach at the thought of camping in sub-zero temperatures, especially with Dominic's men possibly still on the hunt. Yet, there was no denying they all needed rest. Mark's wound required attention, and the truck itself needed a break before its engine gave out. Nodding, she turned to the window, scanning for any sign of an open space, all too aware that nightfall brought a different kind of danger in these silent winter forests. They eventually found a small clearing beside a half-frozen stream, flanked by tall conifers. The sun was dipping below the tree line, painting the sky with streaks of dull orange and mauve. Frank parked the truck near a cluster of boulders that offered some shelter from the wind. When he cut the engine, the ensuing silence felt thick, wrapping around them like a heavy blanket. Sarah slid out, carefully stretching her stiff limbs. Nancy followed, hugging her coat tight. Mark wobbled, wincing as he exited the back seat. The day's chaos had left them all trembling with fatigue. We should set up some kind of heat, Nancy suggested, glancing around with wide eyes. And maybe a fire to keep away wildlife. Frank hesitated. We can't risk a big fire too visible. We'll do something small, and I'll keep it shielded behind the rocks. But I agree we need warmth. It's dropping below freezing fast. They worked in hushed cooperation. Frank gathered fallen branches and dry kindling from under firs. Sarah found a hollow near the boulders that blocked most lines of sight and helped Frank build a modest fire pit. Nancy and Mark unrolled a small tarp from the truck's supplies, creating a makeshift shelter by anchoring it between two trees. It wasn't much, but it offered some windbreak. The temperature plummeted as the last of the sunlight vanished behind the forest canopy, stars beginning to sparkle in the clear sky above. Sparks crackled as Frank lit the kindling. Flames flickered, casting dancing shadows on their exhausted faces. They huddled around the fire, each lost in their own thoughts. Mark cradled his injured arm, letting Nancy reapply antiseptic and fresh gauze. He hissed through clenched teeth but mustered a grateful nod. Sarah busied herself with the laptop for a moment, checking battery levels. Seeing only a faint bar remaining, she decided it was best to conserve power. She shut it down and tucked the device securely back into the duffel. Nancy spoke up, voice tentative. So, where exactly are we headed? I know you said something about Colorado, but that's a long way off. Sarah glanced at Frank, who nodded for her to explain. I have a contact there. she began, choosing her words carefully. He can help verify evidence. I have evidence that a major corporation has been doing something illegal and very dangerous. She rubbed her hands together for warmth. We need to finalize that proof and then release it to the right people. That's the only way to stop them from hunting us. Nancy fiddled with the edge of her coat. You're going to expose them publicly, yes? Sarah replied softly, the gravity of the plan sinking in, or at least get it into the hands of federal investigators. If we succeed, maybe justice gets served. Mark let out a shuddering exhale. Is there going to be a place for me in all this? I'm not exactly used to running for my life. Frank placed a reassuring hand on Mark's shoulder. Kid, none of us are. But you stick with us, and we'll see it through. We owe you that much. A breeze stirred the treetops, sending a chill through the clearing. They passed around a few energy bars and cans of soup heated precariously over the small fire. Nancy's eyes glistened in the firelight as she gazed at the ragtag group, an older mechanic, a wounded traveler, a frightened woman thrust into a conspiracy, and a determined whistleblower. Circumstances had thrown them together, forging a fragile alliance in the face of ruthless pursuit. In the distance, an owl hooted, the sound echoing through the forest. Frank stoked the flames, his mind heavy with questions of what tomorrow would bring. One thing was certain, rest would be short-lived. With dawn would come another leg of their desperate journey, and each mile carried them closer to a final reckoning, either with the truth or with Dominic Shaw's bullets. Frank volunteered for the first watch, settling with his back against a boulder, shotgun balanced across his knees. Sarah managed to catch a few hours of uneasy sleep, drifting in and out of half-formed dreams about corporate boardrooms and bullet-ridden highways. She woke to the faint rustling of pine needles overhead, the sky now a deep, star-filled tapestry. The small fire had dwindled to embers, and the cold bit at every exposed patch of skin. She rose carefully, rubbing her arms for warmth, and made her way to where Frank sat. Any sign of them, she asked in a hushed tone. He shook his head, gazed distant. No vehicles, no footsteps, nothing but wind. He sounded almost disappointed, as though he had expected Dominic Shaw to appear at any moment. Sarah offered him a thermos of lukewarm coffee. Get some rest, she said gently. I'll watch until dawn. Frank hesitated, then nodded. All right, wake me if you see anything. He trudged toward the makeshift shelter, every step weighted by fatigue. Sarah settled herself against a tree, pistol within easy reach. The forest's nocturnal hush enveloped her. It reminded her of nights spent in data centers, the quiet hum of servers, a backdrop to her solitary vigilance. But now, even, the stakes were infinitely higher. Her thoughts drifted to the data lines of code that could topple a corporation. She wondered if it would all be worth it. Would the authorities even believe her? And if they did, would it truly end global trust's corruption? The weight of those questions pressed down, threatening to snuff out her dwindling hope. A branch snapped in the distance, jolting her alert. She lifted the pistol, heart pounding, but the sound didn't repeat, and no shapes emerged from the shadows. Minutes ticked by, each breath visible in the cold. Eventually, faint sunlight began to tease the horizon, turning the sky a deep sapphire. She rose, stepping carefully through the clearing to ensure nothing lurked on its perimeter. Dawn unfurled in shades of pale gold and icy blue. Nancy stirred first, shivering as she emerged from the tarp. Mark followed, bleary-eyed and stiff. Frank soon joined them, stifling a yawn. The quiet was broken by the clinking of a small pot as Nancy tried to heat water over the embers, offering each of them a modest ration of instant oatmeal. They ate in silence, the looming question of their next move hanging in the air. After breakfast, Frank doused the fire, scattering the ashes. We can't leave any sign we were here, he said, stamping out the last few glowing coals. Sarah and Mark gathered their belongings, double-checking the truck. Nancy dusted the snow from her coat, wincing at the chill. Once everything was packed, they climbed back into the old pickup, engine rattling to life in the cold morning air. Steam billowed from the exhaust. Let's follow that forest road, Frank decided. With any luck, we'll hit a county road near the next state line. Then we keep heading south, one step at a time. Sarah's heart thudded with mixed anticipation and dread. Each mile forward brought them closer to Colorado and closer to a possible showdown with Dominic's men, who were surely still hunting them. She clutched the duffel bag and reminded herself of the story's stakes. They weren't running just to save their own skins. They were running for the truth, for the innocent lives tangled in Global Trust's web of deceit. For that, she'd keep moving, no matter what lay ahead. The morning sun glittered on the snow-crusted evergreens as they navigated the winding forest road. Each bend in the path threatened hidden ice patches, so Frank drove carefully. Occasionally, the truck's tires spun out, forcing him to steer into the skid until the rubber gripped again. Nancy clutched the door handle, eyes squeezed shut, while Mark dozed fitfully in the back seat, lulled by the truck's constant rocking. Despite the tension, the scenery was breathtaking in its wintry serenity. Shafts of sunlight broke through the branches, casting mosaic patterns on the snow. A fox darted across the path at one point, pausing to stare at the rumbling vehicle before vanishing into the undergrowth. It felt surreal, a fragile piece overshadowed by their desperate flight. Around midday, the trees began to thin, revealing a rolling expanse of white fields. Through the windshield, Sarah spotted what looked like a small service road running perpendicular to their route. A battered metal sign indicated a county highway number. Frank let out a relieved breath. "Looks like we're back on some semblance of civilization," he announced. They turned onto the county highway, which was mostly cleared of snow. The truck rumbled along at a steady pace, the smell of gasoline lingering from the canisters in the back. Sarah couldn't shake the sense of being watched, though she peered into the side mirror repeatedly, half expecting black SUVs to materialize on the horizon. About an hour later, they approached a modest roadside diner with a flickering neon sign that read Gracie's Cafe. Nancy leaned forward, eyes lighting up. "Do you think we can stop? I just need a moment. Maybe get some proper food." Frank hesitated, his foot easing off the gas. "Not sure if it's wise. We're trying to stay off the grid." Sarah understood Nancy's desperation. They'd been living on canned goods and adrenaline. A warm meal, or even just a chance to wash up, was tempting. She glanced at Frank. "It might be okay if we're quick and careful. Maybe we can ask if there's a back way or a small motel for a short rest." Frank weighed the options, then nodded reluctantly. "All right, but in and out. Keep your eyes open." The parking lot held only a few cars, battered pickups mostly. The cafe itself looked worn but welcoming, a relic from another era with chrome trim and large windows. A sign on the door boasted homemade pies and hot coffee. Nancy practically sighed in relief as they pulled in. Sarah, however, kept her senses on high alert. Inside, the warmth was immediate, along with the aroma of frying bacon and fresh coffee. A tired-looking waitress greeted them, pointing to a booth by the window. Frank tensed but took the seat anyway, his back to the wall so he could see the entrance. Nancy slid in across from him, shoulders relaxing for the first time in days. Mark and Sarah took the adjacent booth, sharing the same worried glance as they surveyed the other patrons, a couple of truckers, an elderly man sipping soup, and a young waitress refilling cups. They ordered quickly, mostly coffee and sandwiches. Nancy asked for a slice of apple pie, voice trembling with anticipation of something normal. As the waitress left, Sarah leaned in, voice low. "We shouldn't stay too long. Dominic's men might have feelers out for a red pickup or any strangers passing through." Frank nodded, scanning the small diner's interior. In the background, an old jukebox played a country tune. For a fleeting moment, it felt almost peaceful, like they'd slipped back into ordinary life. But Sarah knew better. This was a fragile interlude, a calm before the next inevitable storm. The waitress returned with a pot of coffee, steam curling from its spout. Sarah wrapped her hands around the chipped ceramic mug, letting the warmth seep into her stiff fingers. Mark sipped gingerly from his cup, grimacing at the heat. Nancy practically inhaled her slice of pie, moaning softly at the taste of fresh pastry. Even Frank allowed himself a few bites of a cheeseburger, though he never stopped glancing toward the entrance. When the door swung open a moment later, Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. In walked a pair of men in heavy coats, stomping snow off their boots. They looked like locals. One wore a cap with a logging company's logo. The other had a salt and pepper beard. Neither gave more than a passing glance at Sarah's group, seating themselves at the counter. Still, the tension didn't abate. Low conversation filled the diner. The clink of silverware on plates, the soft hum of the fluorescent lights, and the faint twang of country music set an almost cozy backdrop. But Sarah couldn't shake her paranoia. She excused herself to use the restroom, slipping out of the booth with a nod to Frank. The waitress pointed her to a narrow hallway toward the back. Inside the tiny restroom, Sarah splashed water on her face, catching a glimpse of her reflection in the scratched mirror. Dark circles under her eyes, tension etched into every line. She dried her face and leaned against the sink, letting out a shaky breath. If only she could call Thomas Bridges, warn him or get guidance, but any phone call risked being traced. Her thoughts scattered when the restroom door creaked open. She turned, half expecting trouble, but it was just Nancy, eyes darting uncertainly. Mind if I... She gestured to the stall. Sarah moved aside, allowing Nancy to pass. Sarah waited near the door, arms folded. Nancy emerged a minute later, looking a bit more composed. She met Sarah's gaze in the mirror, voice hushed. Thank you for not leaving me behind. I know I'm complicating everything. It's not your fault, Sarah said softly. You got caught in something none of us expected. She laid a reassuring hand on Nancy's shoulder. We'll figure it out. Once we get to Colorado, maybe we can even help you reunite with your sister. Nancy's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away. I hope so. I've never been this scared in my life. Those men, the way they chased us, it was like something out of a nightmare. Sarah nodded, her own fear resonating in Nancy's words. I know, but we're still alive, and that means we still have a chance. She turned toward the door, pressing an ear against it to listen for any commotion in the diner. Hearing only the faint clatter of dishes, she exhaled. Let's get back before Frank starts to worry. They returned to the booths, where the group finished their meal quickly. Frank insisted on paying in cash to avoid leaving any digital footprint. As they stood to leave, the waitress ambled over. Road's pretty bad ahead, she said conversationally. Heard on the radio there's an accident on the main highway, couple of black SUVs. One slid into the median. Police are checking it out. Sarah's blood ran cold. She traded a look with Frank, who tensed. Thanks for the heads up, he said evenly. The waitress continued, oblivious to the tension. You folks drive safe now. You hear? She gave them a friendly nod as they pulled on their coats and left a handful of crumpled bills on the counter. Outside, the wind had picked up. Snow whipped around them as they hurried to the truck. Frank started the engine, scanning the parking lot for anything suspicious. We'll keep to back roads, he said. If the police are involved, maybe Dominic's men will have to lay low for a while. Sarah stared at the swirling snow, heart pounding. She had a feeling things were about to escalate further. With a grim sense of resolve, she clutched the duffel bag. The final stretch to Colorado would be the most treacherous yet, and time was running out. They left Gracie's Cafe behind, the truck crawling along a winding route that the diner's waitress had pointed out on an old paper map tacked to the wall. Clouds thickened overhead, threatening another heavy snowfall. Frank turned onto a county road lined with tall pines and bare aspens, the winter landscape stretching endlessly in every direction. Nancy huddled in the front seat, still clutching the lingering warmth of the diner's coffee in a disposable cup. Mark, half asleep in the back, mumbled about finding a proper bed once they reached safety. Sarah studied the map, mentally calculating how many hours lay between them and the Colorado state line. As they rounded a bend, the trees opened onto a wide valley. The sight of it was majestic rolling hills capped with snow, distant mountains shimmering like pale ghosts. Yet, All Sarah could think about was how exposed they were. She kept glancing at the rearview mirror, expecting the glint of headlights at any moment. Dominic Shaw might have lost a few men, but there was no telling how many resources Global Trust was willing to throw into retrieving their precious data. Frank slowed, carefully navigating a steep descent. The truck's engine growled in protest, tires sliding over icy patches. "We'll need to chain the tires if it gets any worse," he muttered. Nancy nodded, her knuckles whitening around the coffee cup. They were halfway down the slope when a sharp crack echoed across the valley like a rifle shot. The truck lurched, Frank fighting to keep control. Sarah craned her neck, scanning the tree line. She saw nothing but swirling snow. Another shot echoed, then another. The windshield spiderwebbed with cracks as a bullet struck it, sending shards of glass sprinkling into the cabin. Nancy screamed, and Mark jolted awake, fumbling for his rifle. "Drive," Sarah shouted, adrenaline surging. Frank pressed the accelerator, the truck fishtailing. More bullets peppered the ground, kicking up sprays of snow. One tore through the side mirror. Another thunked into the tailgate, heart hammering. Sarah leaned out her window, pistol in hand, trying to spot the shooter. The angle was impossible, the valley amplifying sound in all directions. Frank tried to maintain control as the truck swerved dangerously close to a snowbank. "We can't stay on the road," he yelled. "We're too exposed." Without waiting for agreement, he yanked the wheel, guiding the truck off the slope and into a patch of dense, snow-laden shrubs. Branches snapped and scraped the undercarriage, the vehicle jostling them like passengers on a turbulent flight. The gunfire continued, sporadic but persistent, as though herding them away from the open road. Snow and broken branches whipped at the windows. Nancy sobbed, clutching the dashboard. Mark braced against the seat, rifle in hand, but no clear target to shoot at. Sarah's pulse pounded in her ears. This wasn't some random ambush. This was a calculated attempt to corner them. She glimpsed movement among the pines, dark shapes shifting in the white gloom. Bullets whistled past, one punching through the back window and lodging in the roof. "We have to keep going," Frank shouted, wrestling the truck forward through the brush. The engine roared, tires clawing at the snow. At last, they broke through the undergrowth onto slightly flatter ground. Ahead lay a twisting trail that snaked upward, away from the valley floor. Without hesitation, Frank steered onto it, the truck laboring for traction. Sarah glanced at him, breath ragged. "We can't outrun them forever," she said, voice trembling with both fear and resolve. Frank's gaze flickered to the duffel bag, then to Nancy and Mark. "We don't need forever," he murmured. "Just long enough to get across that border and find your friend. One way or another, this ends soon." Clutching the pistol, Sarah nodded, a cold determination settling in her bones. She would see this through, no matter the periods. The truck lurched on, deeper into the maze of snow-covered trails. The next battle for survival just beyond the veil of pines. In the end, it wasn't just about the truth, it was about the price paid to uncover it. Lives forever changed. Innocence lost to the bitter winds of winter and the cold reality of what people become when pushed to their limits. The road they traveled was long and unforgiving, paved with courage and sacrifice, shadowed by those who sought silence above all else. Some wounds heal with time, while others linger beneath the surface. Reminders of battles fought and choices made. The echoes of gunfire fade, replaced by the quiet courage of those left standing. Their strength forged in the fire of desperation. Their spirits tested but unbroken. Yet, despite everything, beneath the scars and sorrow remains hope, fragile, yes, but unmistakably alive. A quiet belief that even in darkness, a single voice can ignite change, and that every act of courage echoes long after the dust settles. As we watch the shadows lengthen and the snow drifts silently across forgotten trails, perhaps we might ask ourselves if faced with the same darkness, would we find within ourselves the strength to light a candle, knowing full well the